Okay, this is kind of long overdue, a nice sort of aggregate of the origin of metagram in terms of explained in terms of metatype. Now, this recording is going to be very embarrassing because I've forgotten this in terms of my actual project, which started 25 years ago. Um, I either forgot it or I knew that I didn't know this and that I knew that it had to sort of be reverse engineered, but I knew enough of it, I knew enough of the structure of it, or of what the structure contains, that it was okay. So maybe it's the same difference. I think I think it's not that I didn't know it, but I knew the ballpark or something like that. Okay, so either way, it's very embarrassing to have to say things like this. Anyway, makes the whole thing seem very awful. But anyway, okay, so let me. Also, the excuse for this is that I was dealing with something that was empirically there. Obviously, the problem in psychology is, well, how do you model something that is obviously apparent, but you need to understand enough of the structures, and you need to understand in a in a in terms of how the thing that you're trying to model that seems apparent in terms of what structure is obviously represented in the phenomena. Um, okay, so let me just talk about where I think I am, and this is slightly speculative. So a lot of this might be wrong, in need of revision. The problem is that the 12 model will unlock a lot of this, and I'm still basically reverse engineering how the 12 model exactly relates to the 17 model in terms of metagram. And that is actually the whole difference between metagram and metatype. And maybe I should actually revise my notes. Maybe that'll click when I'm talking this out. Um, I mean, I guess when I say the thing that's weird about the 12 model is that it is its own thing. That the 12 model really is a standalone entity and structure that operates all within its own substrate. It's just incommensurate with the 17 model, which is actually the thing that is doing the false ego complex. Um, and so when you jump between them, it's completely different. And then, well, the question is that how do you know whether sort of the seed of the false ego complex is relative to the 12 model? That's the question that has to be asked. Is it that one of those dimensions in the 12 model is the expression, or it is perhaps it's two? Actually, that actually sounds more correct. That there are two. There's a combination of two things within the 12 model, which between those two, that prime interaction, the cascade of the false ego complex then sort of generates. Okay. Okay. So what are these emotional circuits linked together in giant long circuits? Especially since the formulation, the prime formulation of metagram is that there are six emotional tones that are linked together in a chain. How do these things relate to one another? Now, the thing is that this emotional circuitry is very strange because it's not experienced as an emotion. Emotion might even be the wrong word. I'd usually call them emotional tones. So it's describing when you overlay the circuitry over the standard model that I use of the false ego complex, which is six entities or six interlocking stages made up of the unconscious, the subconscious, and the ego function. And each of those each of those components has two things in it. So the unconscious is made up of the death and the lust. The subconscious is made up of the vanity and the enticed lust, and the ego function is made up of the trial and the sin. Now, the first one always being a perception, the second one always being a judgment. So the death is a perception, the lust is a judgment, the vanity is a perception, the enticed lust is a judgment, the trial is a perception, the sin is a judgment. Now, that model is just of the adult ego complex. It does not include the original superego or the inner child, and also the magic of trying to have that model, that 6-stage model, combined with the original superego inner child. Then you have to also invent a 7th entity or a 7th stage, which would be the false prophet. And the false prophet would come just before the death. So it would go false prophet, death, lust. And the false prophet would also somewhat resonate with the sin. That the sin and the false prophet would actually have the same emotional tone, but it would come before it, before the death. And so in some sense, when the sin is happening, it's re-stimulating the false prophet, which helps to initiate the re-stimulation of the other 6 stages. So the sin, when the judgment of the sin falls, the false prophet reinitiates the 6 stages. And I've talked about this constructively when I've talked about the false prophet contract. That the whole thing is that the whole process is encapsulated within what I call the false prophet contract, which also has a very deep resonance with the vanity. That might also be incorrect. Maybe the false prophet, which is in some sense encapsulated within another dimension, the dimension below it. Maybe there should be a distinction between the false prophet and the false prophet contract. And the false prophet contract is still done by the false prophet dimension or function, but the quality of the contract is a stage that is even below the false prophet. So it goes false prophet, contract, false prophet, death, lust, vanity, and then essentially because then you'd see that, and essentially, so I mean, it might be actually, okay, I'm sort of making this up on the fly, but that the false prophet contract has a kind of re-stimulative conjunction of the vanity, that perhaps the false prophet contract, if I'm right in this ordering, the false prophet contract would have the same emotional tone as the vanity, and the false prophet will have the same emotional tone as the sin. And although that those are like constructively out of order, actually I can't say that, I haven't looked at emotional tone circuitry in a long time. This might also be important because some double circuits don't occur organically as double circuits. They start off as a single circuit and then they develop the other circuit. And so it could be that in those types of cases of double circuits, the false prophet contract is only one of the 2 circuits in terms of that stage of the false ego complex. But then over the development of the false ego, the second circuit emerges, but it's always a secondary affair. And so that might also account for some of the variety in personality style manifestation, that some people with the same metagram type develop uniquely and within a particular spectrum of variety, because of, and that would also give rise to some variety in personality manifestation, because how someone inculcated the second circuit would might happen at a different stage of life, might happen at a different stage of development, in terms of the generally, when you're dealing with someone, the reason why they seem like a unique person, even though that you might know some people that are very, very similar to them, and I mean, there's some people that you meet that are, it's absolutely uncanny how similar their personalities are. It's very rare, but you sometimes come across it. Two people that have almost very clear identical personality styles. Or sometimes you find people that are very, very close, but they're almost like they're inverted. Like one little aspect of them is inverted. Like their weight is their weighting in some internal structure, you can tell, is just, it's just like what, it's like a chiral. You're dealing with a kind of chiral structure, that's just, going left to right instead of right to left, to another personality that you're familiar with. That the reason for that phenomena, because I'm getting to this as well, is that the emotional tones themselves, that I've mapped with this in some sense, that I've mapped personality styles with, are properties of the subconscious primarily. So to map the false ego complex via the subconscious is because the subconscious, actually I'd need to amend that. It's not just the subconscious, it's basically the subconscious plus the unconscious. So I have described the false ego complex in terms of the unconscious, the death and the lust, and the subconscious, the vanity and the enticed lust. Because between those four items, so those four items, now let me just say that in terms of metatype, it is generally believed that those four items are going to be locked into four consecutive dimensions on the 17 model. So those four items are just going to happen to fall on four consecutive things. Now, then those four consecutive dimensions on the 17 model, so that whatever someone is in terms of well, okay, that's the fundamental structure of the false ego complex as I have decided to model it. And then I've said, well, why am I choosing this as the prime thing? Because so much of the false ego is fundamentally unconscious. This is the problem. But it's worse than that. It's not only fundamentally unconscious, but the other half of it is subconscious, which is even more problematic. So I have chosen the most problematic aspects of the false ego complex to hang all the modeling of the false ego complex of, because that's the only way to make sure that you've got account of everything, and that you can actually, that you're dealing with the overarching impact and influence and pressure exerted, atmospheric, sort of social influence, that they're perpetrating, essentially. It's the only way that you can take account of everything that it is that they are doing, essentially, cognitively, and also, but cognitively on an unconscious level. So the unthought knowns. I'm going to go into this. So why is this important? Now, okay, so the reason, this is important stuff that I'm talking about, but so it's when you're looking at a metagram circuit of emotional, of the emotional tones locked into this tautological argument of 6 stages that then re-stimulate themselves, is it's a bit of a theoretical extrapolation when I talk about the false prophet and the false prophet contract, and the false prophet contract relating to the vanity, the emotional tone of the vanity, and the false prophet relating to the sin. Uh, that's a theoretical extension that I would actually have to look at the metagram circuitry and see how well that lines up. And then also there's a problem because where does that actually fit in relation to the original superego, as I call it, or the original inner child? And does the original inner child have its own false prophet and false prophet contract? And if it does, it might, in some almost metaphorical sense, that might also be a very powerful tool of therapy, because in some sense that might be to condition, to diagnose the condition, the atmospheric condition of the metaphysical um, environment. It, in some sense, would be to psychologize the ontological trigger of the child embroiling itself, entangling itself in atmospheric trauma and drama, and in some sense, it's almost like a diagnosing of the of the mixed entity, of the individual mixed up in the situation, as it were. And because essentially that confusion, that initial diffusion of accountability and responsibility is what has been baked into the false ego complex as a fundamental premise, but it's been hidden and been removed from that by doing it yet again. So it's done it twice when it created the adult ego complex. So it's kind of like it's a doubling down on the same sort of strategy. And it's these confusions that have been inculcated within the false ego complex that makes it stable. And the problem is that those fundamental confusions, which sort of, because again, like that secondary, or not, it's not secondary because it actually happens prior, but that environmental, as it were, false prophet and false prophet contract, which is something that would be a kind of subtextual model of the substrate, would be like, okay, well, in some sense, the unit of the individual psyche plus the environmental conditioning sort of created a kind of fundamental operating, like a kind of, the superego was doing this. And so the superego didn't believe this, but it was as if it did believe it. It just, because this is how it operated, this is how it managed its environment. And so because it was imprinted by a kind of configuration of manifest behavior and operation. So it was as if that these dimensions were operating in this way. And so there's a fundamental merger of the individual with the environment that has been mixed into the foundation of even the adult ego complex, because which is like once removed. And so fixing that at some point of the therapeutic process is a very important process for removing oneself from the adult ego, perhaps after being so aware of wanting to remove, it's almost like removing yourself from the matrix. You can't just unplug yourself from the matrix. You first have to know, oh, there is another world to be unplugged into, to appear within after you're unplugged. You have to sort of, because when you unplug yourself, you're not just in the same universe as what the world appeared like. So before you are unplugged, you have to know that when you are unplugged, that everything is going to look very, very different. The situation is going to be completely um, distinct, distinctly different. Because anyway, I'm not going to continue with that analogy, but yeah, that's a kind of important point to be made. So essentially, how this practically is built into it, I think, has to do with a kind of metaphysical sadness. that there are layers of chains, as it were, which are kind of like unthought knowns, in which the contraction of the cognitive space or the decision space is contracted into a container that has inbuilt within it the grooves and the kind of the shape that is required to safely maintain the recurring structure of the false ego complex. So thought itself is conditioned in a kind of decision space. What I would refer to as decision space, I generally relate to the structure of the unconscious, the death and the lust. So it's sort of like they are beliefs that contract and therefore also provide grooves um, of a kind of preordained, schematized um, functions within the so there's a kind of there's a stable sample space of cognitive domain, um, which is essentially locked into by a kind of metaphysical sadness. Now, the metaphysical sadness, in some sense, is represented by the emotional argument, by the emotional tone tautology, by the 6 emotional tones that I have modeled in Metagram, which is centered around the unconscious and the subconscious, the four consecutive dimensions on the metatype. Um, and in some and then I think that as well that those dimensions are, it's not, in some sense it's not just those dimensions, because obviously those dimensions are, as part, the 17 model always implies all of itself, that wherever you are, there it has dimensions below it and dimensions above it. It has an innate structure. It's part of a 17. So what's my point? So I'm just basically trying to say that the meaning of this is that when you're looking at the emotional tone thing, you have to know that the ego functions are, in some sense, the only things that you can think. You can only think in terms of the ego functions. You can't think, you don't even have direct access to the subconscious and the unconscious emotional tones. You don't experience them as a thinking human being. And in some sense, the strongest element of the emotional tone argument is the subconscious, because the subconscious is describing itself. So the 2 emotional tones that make up the subconscious are like the engine of the false ego. So if you understand and those are almost the 2 prime emotional tones. And then the 2 emotional tones that make up the unconscious are the unthought. They are kind of, they are implicit. They are the subtext of your subconscious in some sense. They are literally the impact of the unthought knowns. In some sense, it's a map of, when I was saying that the contracted sample space of cognitive functioning, um, let's say the hard container of the schema that makes up the personality style, the schematized roads and grooves that has been carved out on a solid shape that makes up the container of the sample space of cognitive function, uh, that is an object within the actual possibility of cognitive functioning. The substracted self-image in some sense. The death. That's what the death is. The death is a calcified, crystallized, smaller object uh, that, as an object, is taking up this space um, of potential and possibility that is constraining the possibility. Um, Belief, but it's belief of a self-image. So it's a belief about character, which then becomes a kind of fatalistic destiny, whatever. In terms of how those beliefs shape the flow of functioning that then come after it, they are represented as the two emotional tones in the unconscious. So the death and the lust, those two emotional tones, which then lead on to the vanity and the enticed lust, you can't even think about that. You can't you can't think those. Those are unthought knowns. Those two emotional tones are unthought knowns. They are shaping your subconscious, and your subconscious is the actual workhorse of your cognition. The only conscious cognition that you have is the ego function, and you can intimate your subconscious from your ego function. Because you can know, well, if I'm thinking these thoughts, I must have had a feeling. You have a belief, you have a feeling. You have a feeling, you have a thought. That's how it goes. You have thoughts after you have feelings, and you have beliefs before you have thoughts. But some of your beliefs are, to use a psychology word, unthought knowns. Well, I call unthought knowns beliefs. So that's just my kind of jargon. And in some sense, they have to be unthought. So that means that they cannot they are not allowed to be consciously apprehended. Um, so in some sense, you because you can't think them, those two emotional tones are in some sense made impossible, and they're made impossible by, in some metaphysical sense, coming earlier in the argument. And so you don't want to undermine your own argument. You don't want to go back to the premise. You want to argue. You've moved on from the premise of the argument. So the best way to see the metagram circuitry is like an emotional argument, and you've got two premises, and then you've got like I don't actually know all the technical all the technical language of arguments, but you've got essentially the middle bit of the syllogism, and then you've got the conclusion essentially. But there's a thing, but generally the conscious mind is not doesn't actually want to make the conclusion final. They are trying to kind of make sure that they're on top of the problem before the conclusion comes, so that the word for this is damn it, I just had it now. The conclusion. Um, that they've done the working out. Oh no. I just thought of a good metaphor for that in terms of what the trial is. That the trial is just almost like a rating of confidence that that the argument has a kind of fidelity that it covers what it's trying to attach itself to pertaining to. Okay, so like a lot of the issue with the false ego complex is that it's based. I mean, fundamentally, if you want to get a little bit spiritual or something like that, a little bit philosophical, you understand that you don't want to be arguing about reality. It's a waste of time. It's not going to happen. That you can't argue. Arguments are fundamentally not soluble things at their core. Like, why are you arguing about something? You're only arguing about something because someone has made a claim. Why is anyone bothered to make a claim? You need to understand epistemic pragmatism. You need to understand epistemic responsibilism. Epistemological pragmatism. You need to read On Nihilism by Vasti Root. Your claim for a kind of truth conduciveness is already fundamentally flawed. It's the wrong way to go. You haven't taken into account the actual sort of absurdist sort of trap. What was I saying now? Arguments. The reason why these arguments are sort of inexorable, or why people are locked into making them, is to escape essentially trauma which has been baked into their self-conception, and then they have tried to make an adult ego from that precarious cradle of their psychological situation. And now they would, if they really want to get these things right, they have to kind of they need to get back to decision space. They need to fix their beliefs. I think Metagram could be a useful tool, but obviously I need to do more work in describing and explaining what exactly it's relating to. But so yeah, and sadly that also requires still some of an extension of my theory to get deeper into the false prophet and the false prophet contract, and just to confirm that those things are true, that they relate to the vanity and the sin. That the vanity relates to the false prophet contract, and that the sin relates to the emotional tone of the false prophet. Okay, so I just want to say that metagram is a description of the false ego complex, primarily from the point of view of the subconscious and how the subconscious interacts with the unconscious. That's what it is. So it's a tool to diagnose, to self-diagnose, or for perhaps a clinician to diagnose the state of the individual, and to be able to pick apart their case, to pick apart how they're operating psychologically, and to orientate themselves. I would say that what needs to happen first is you need to introduce yourself to decision space, which would be analogously to being offered the red pill or the blue pill in the Matrix. Now, it's very hard for someone to have the clarity to even approach decision space when they are embroiled in their false ego complex too heavily. So let me just talk about this. So So there are two ways of modeling the false ego complex, and I chose the subconscious um, because the subconscious is also the middle ground between the unconscious and the ego function. But I mean, obviously, one knows what one is cognitive of. One knows that you're thinking as you are thinking. One knows the stream of thoughts that go through your mind. One has direct access to that. But and metagram does describe that in emotional tones. Obviously, perhaps it's slightly obtuse, um, because basically it's a reduction. Well, everything that you're thinking is this perception, and then followed by this judgment every once in a while, or that looming judgment, or you anticipate that judgment, or whatever. And perceiving things in this lens, in this filter of this emotional tone. So it's a kind of, it's very reductive. Um, it's reductive and abstract. Um, but the real treasure of metagram is that it gives you access to your subconscious and to your unconscious mind in relation to your stream of consciousness, so that you can think about your thinking, that you can get underneath it, you can get deeper than it, you can use it to penetrate the subconscious and then the unconscious. Now, in some sense, when one starts to acquire, I mean, a lot of people can do the work of realizing that their life is a sequence of drama that is recurring along some theme, that their overarching travailing occurrences are somewhat mechanistically being spat out. Um, that this thing is manifesting mechanically. Now, and that has to do with some kind of structure. People can be curious as to that. How am I captive to my own character, or to my own psychology, or something like that? That what is this servitude that I have? I mean, if you have the philosophical inclination to think that this is something that is unnatural or problematic, and that you're doing it to yourself, then you will generally be on the right track to working out how you were a prisoner of your own mind forged manacle, something like that. And that there are elements of that which seem so deeply embedded that how would you ever even come to confront it? And then do you even have the courage and the insight to incisively pursue that line of thinking, as potentially devastating as that is? You have to be willing to give up quite a lot to concern yourself with that kind of quandary. Anyway, the scriptures talk all over the place about how the rich man will not find how does the rich man find the kingdom of heaven? It's like putting a camel through the eye of a needle and things like that. But the rich man is not the materially rich man. It's someone who is rich with their own thoughts, with their own narrative, with their own thinking. That is actually what the rich man is. The rich man is an attitude. It's not material things. When it says the meek will inherit the earth, there are many poor people who are very rich with their egotism and their pride. That's what makes them also often unable to engage with and participate and coordinate to a high degree. Their rigidity is a form of decadence. Um, it's not some kind of it's a kind of self-righteousness within the character that they have already baked up, rather than with this incisive idea of actually even being okay with undermining their own vanity. Okay, sorry, let me just move on. The subconscious. What is the subconscious? Okay, so to arrive at decision space, you have to be looking to observe your own subconscious, which requires a kind of stillness, not exactly a stillness, but a kind of transcendental quality in terms of how you treat your own conscious mind. And the best way to describe this is hate. If you if you hate all your thinking, all your cognitive thinking, if you just hate it, you're willing to look at it in any light possible. Not a light that helps you obscure it, but to look at it in every light possible. If you're capable of looking at all of your conscious thoughts in every light possible, if you're capable of conceiving that, you don't have to actually. Hate is not an active thing. Hate is a meta transcendental sort of appreciation of it. This is what is talked about in the scriptures when Jesus says, hate your brother and your sister and your mother and your father and even your own life to be worthy to be a disciple. That's the kind of, it's a kind of detachment. It's a complete detachment to your, so hate is a very important part of detachment. So when you detach yourself in that way, now being detached doesn't mean that you're not also actively doing things that you have to be responsible for. It just means understanding cognitively the scope of possible responsibility in some sense, that you know everything from the other side as well. So in some sense, you know why you're doing something. Jesus asked of this woman, why are you feeding the dogs? I can't remember exactly what she said, but she says basically, well, the dogs are hungry too, and it sort of implied that, well, if you don't feed a dog, it basically becomes like a hungry wolf. Um, but the point is that she knew why she was doing it. She knew why she was feeding the dogs. There was a completeness. It's kind of like, you don't just do things for positive reasons, you also do them because those positive reasons can be framed as a negative as well, as well. You love to do something because you would hate the converse to happen. That sort of appreciation is important in detachment. Okay, so now being detached doesn't mean that you are a detached self-image. It just means that you are capable of detachment, and that this is problematic because this is not really the solution. This is just a tool. So the point of detachment is not detachment. The point of detachment needs a purpose, and in some sense, hopefully what your purpose is to get a handle and control over your purpose, because your purpose is unconsciously controlled. So I don't want to philosophize too much about that, because that tool is not the answer to everything, but it is an important ingredient. Okay, so getting to decision space, this is probably a very bad recitation of a tool set to unlocking yourself, or whatever. This is not good general philosophy, but anyway, let me just continue. So there's some kind of ethos like that. There's some kind of method like that. Now, when you achieve detachment, you will gain access to seeing your subconscious, and the subconscious that will appear will basically be the metagram emotional tones of the subconscious. Now, so when you basically, in metaphorical terms, when you've stilled the activity, you haven't actually necessarily stopped thinking. That can be part of a kind of, I guess that's the point of meditation, is you're doing things with the mind almost on a scientific level so that you can work out where it's coming from. So you can work out the movements that are creating those things. So that you can work out, well, where are these structures, where are these subconscious structures which are described? They're described by the metagram circuits in the subconscious. But again, that's just a description. That's not an explanation. The explanation as to why you have these subconscious themes, which are described in my emotional tones, is because of your own decisions that you've made, that you've forgotten about perhaps as well. You have a decision tree. You've made decisions about, oh, do I want the red one or the blue one? What is my favorite color? You have all these decisions. And at some point you made decisions about who you are. And that's a very important kind of decision, because some of these things, they don't make sense. Some of these decisions are just weird, or just nonsensical, but they kind of operate in conglomeration with other decisions, and they just kind of, they all are like hodgepodge together, and they make up uncorrelated beliefs, or so you've got lots and lots of beliefs, and they are there and waiting to, in their chaos, delimit the shape of the cognitive container that you have to operate as a false ego complex. So they are there to impede the sample space of cognitive functioning. In some sense, you can see that the unconscious works almost directly against the space of the ego, the stages of the ego function. There's a kind of primal antagonism. That is, even if you can. Okay, anyway, that's actually skipping over the subconscious. So you have to understand that the ego function is like an analysis on the movement in your mind, and the only movement that exists in your mind is the subconscious. The subconscious is the only motion that your cognitive thoughts, that your actual the thoughts that you are aware of, is judging the movement, the action that is happening. But the only action that is happening in your mind is happening in accordance with a structure of beliefs, which can be disordered, they can be chaotic, some of them might be orderly, but generally all of those beliefs, or to a large extent, many of those beliefs, some of them can be picked out through the movement. And you can actually say, well, this belief must be a prime belief. And so your conscious mind is reading an interpretation of your belief. But most of your beliefs are not conscious at all. They are a commixture of conscious and unconscious, at the very least. And in some sense, the unconscious, in some sense, wins out. So your reading of your own beliefs is even a kind of analytical fiction to some degree. But your conscious mind can make a map can try to make a stable model of it. And so my argument is that, well, actually the best model of what your beliefs actually are is something like metagram. But obviously, you need to unlock decision space so that you can change the structure of the tree, so that you can cut away the death, so that you can collapse. So essentially that the ego function can import both the domain of operation of the unconscious and the subconscious. And you would do this essentially by uncovering the decision space of the unconscious, but first the subconscious. Well, you only have access to the unconscious through the subconscious. Because, so in some sense, what you want to do is you want to increase the amount of motion that the subconscious portends. And you do that by detachment, essentially. So in some sense, you're breaking. So the first chain that you have to break is the chain of the ego function, which is described by the metagram tones, which is a kind of, which will already tune you into the subconscious. And then what you're trying to do, I've described it before, is you're trying to perfect the vanity. Because if you can perfect the vanity, you can break the vanity simultaneously and transcend it. So in some sense, what you really want to do is you're trying to break the, inverted commas, false prophet contracts to include anything and everything. Then you have access. Then if you can actually do that, then you'll have full access to the unconscious. And then when you're dealing with those unconscious beliefs, what you are also doing is you are breaking down emotional walls, which are kind of like creating eddies. They are irregular structures within the decision space. So first of all, you're dealing with a decision space which has an emotional consequence attached to it. It has an emotional eminence. It has an emotional connotation, because you are used to operating in such a way so as to remain unconscious of the belief structure that was stabilizing an emotional rubric of anticipatory. Usually it's the anticipatory judgments which are going to hold you. It's the enticed lust is going to actually be, it's always going to be the judgment that is going to be the gatekeeper on unhinging the perception, which is the inculcated, calcified structure, which is really what you need to revise the perception. You need to undermine the perception. But you can't do that until you've desensitized the charge of the judgment. And so your subconscious can be in such a state that it is so attuned and ordered that that a new structure is capable of actuating and managing the malformed flow. But you're just not aware. Your conscious mind hasn't accessed that space to reorder it. So it's just doing the status quo, because you just haven't been in that vicinity yet. And so it's kind of, so you've got a slightly fragmented cognitive operation in some sense. You don't have a holistic cognitive operation. This can also be very problematic, because when you're in a kind of process of metamorphosis, and you're dealing with this sort of stuff, the fundamental unconscious structures can agitate and escalate a revision back to back to the old stable pattern and cognitive habit. Because conditions are reminiscent of the original decision-making tree process that necessitated the shaping of cognition into an argument that can contend against countervailing arguments. So in some sense, there are like contestation. Uh, the contestation of beliefs. The contestation of unthought knowns would be very triggering. In Scientology, they call this having your anchor points driven in, so that you're no longer consciously in control of your anchor points. That you've forgotten that you've made anchor points, and that other people are helping you stabilize your anchor points by sort of reacting, by forcing reactions and by applying kind of stimuli that create a kind of significance and importance on the decision to react to those anchor points. And that reaction and automatic observation is a necessary safety and a necessary relegation to some higher end, to some external purpose that is then no longer internally contended. There's no internal concerted effort that somehow you're imagining that you're sharing in the effort provided by an external auspice, the God of the world, as it were. The spirit of man, that you are just a container for an external purpose. Anyway, so the death is fundamentally restimulative. The theme that relates to the death. Now, it is the substrate of the subconscious, which is the motion of the mind. So in some sense, you don't even have to fix the death to some degree. If you can fix all the motion, you fix the death. Fixing all the motion of the subconscious. If you reach into every operation that the mind can make, and you have it under the new system, and you revise it from the old system, then there's no more mark of the subconscious left. There's no more mark of the false ego complex left. But the hook of the death would still be, if not defeated conceptually, would still be capable. I mean, in some sense, you would think that these things would somewhat be incommensurate, but they are separable issues. And also vice versa, that you can destroy the hook of the death, but not clean up all the subconscious functioning. That these things are actually separable psychological processes. Because the decision space, in some sense, has to be consciously engaged in and consciously revised, as well as the secondary operations that flow from. Because if you remove the undergirding architect, you don't necessarily demolish the building, or replace the building, or revamp the building. Or go through the building and pick through the parts that you like and the aspects that you like in the controlled demolition or whatever. It's just important to know that the only thing real that you're going to do is change the perception, but you can't change the perception without going through the judgment. So if you don't have a purpose that is in some sense purer and stronger than the judgment, than the charge of the judgment, you're not going to have access, and you're not going to have the power to do anything different to the perception. Because if you're still controlled by the judgment, by the force of the judgment, you're not going to be able to dismantle the perception related to it. You cannot defeat the vanity or perfect the vanity if you are under the control of the enticed lust, and you cannot do anything about the death if you are functioning in accordance with the lust. There might be a kind of trick to this in which you have to kind of... There is actually a trick to this, which is why attachment is important, because in some sense you also can't access the perception unless you go through the lust, which means that you have to you can't just negate the lust or the enticed lust if you're trying to deal with the vanity, actually, and you have to deal with the vanity first, so maybe I should focus on that. Is that to deal with the vanity, you actually have to understand the enticed lust, and it's not about agreeing with it or disagreeing with it. You have to do both. You have to agree and disagree with it. You can't just say it's wrong. You can't try to negate it. That doesn't work either. You can't do the opposite of it. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to do the inverse of it. There's no such thing. You have to do both, in some sense. You have to explore it to the extent that you exhaust it. You can't negate it. You can't turn your back on it. You have to overpower it. You have to find its break point. You have to exhaust it, is probably the best word. So you have to add to it, not try to subtract from it. You have to add to it so that it cancels it out, so that you've fully apprehended it in some sense. Again, you've also then made it conscious. This is problematic because the thing that you're making conscious in some sense is a kind of meta-consciousness. But in some sense, I wonder if you could say that, because the first thing you have to do is detach from your stream of consciousness by adding to it. I guess perhaps you say that what you're adding to it is the subconscious. That is, in some sense, maybe the only thing that you are doing is you're adding your subconscious to your conscious, you're adding the subconscious to the ego function. That's the only tool that you have, is to take your ego function, which is the only thing that you have, and to first combine it with the subconscious. And then after you have combined it with the subconscious, which is through the enticed lust, you gain access to the vanity, you perfect the vanity. So your first goal in spiritual life is to, as I say, perfect the vanity. Then at least if you're halfway to perfecting the vanity, you can start to understand the state of the unconscious mind, the structure of the lust and the death. And then again, you have to go through the lust to cut away the death. So I'm just trying to think now how these metagram tones can be useful for this. I mean, I guess this is why I keep on saying that, like, I mean, maybe it's not even important to say the false prophet and the false prophet contract. Maybe, I mean, that's just as saying that, well, the first thing that you have to deal with, well, no, actually, maybe it is a good metaphor, because then, and in terms of where I place them, because then when you're focusing in on the unconscious, you have to understand that the unconscious is metaphorically premised first on the false prophet and then on the vanity. That you have to go through the vanity, and you have to go through the sin. First you have to kind of see the sin, and then you have to see the vanity that is underpinning the unconscious. Now, that's a little bit weird and strange, because both of those things are not the same thing. That the sin is a judgment and the vanity is a perception. And you have to kind of see the unconscious mind as an amalgamation of a sin and a vanity, a judgment and a perception, because you don't have access to the unconscious directly. So you have to kind of triangulate it through the other sides of the mind. You have to feel it out through the other sides of the mind. And so you have to understand, or you have to model, that the unconscious mind is undergirded by something that is analogous to the sin and something that is analogous to the vanity. And these things come from different sources, but these two things are fundamentally underneath it. I mean, maybe what I just said is actually a false formula. Maybe that's actually not how to do it. Maybe there are other ways of triangulating it in some sense. Maybe you should use the trial and the entice lust. Maybe you should actually track it in terms of. I think that would be too stimulative, though. I think because you do need to go through the sin. If you go through the sin, then you know that you are going through the ego function, and you're arriving at the subconscious. And then you have to go through the subconscious, but in some sense, I don't think you can. I don't think you can actually reach the unconscious mind, because the only thing that you have to reach the unconscious mind is the is the vanity. So the perfected vanity plus going through the sin is, I think, the key to apprehending the state of belief in some sense. But it's going to be metaphorical. You're dealing with something that is fundamentally, it cannot, it's literally like the definite, it's pure purpose itself. It has an unlimited, it doesn't ever get, beliefs can never come into a clarity, an absolute delineated clarity, because you can build any belief mechanism under the sun. There's no limit. It's literally infinite what you can do with belief. And so you can't say, well, this is even your belief. You cannot do that, but you can say that this is what it's doing, that this is the space that it creates, that this is the atmosphere in the subconscious. And so you can only even hope to kind of model the space that it is emanating by a perfected vanity in some sense. And beliefs then are fundamentally, it's kind of like a giant prism or a giant sort of faceted jewel, and whatever you are shining light through, it's going to create a hologram. And so the belief is like that faceted jewel, and if you just move the light slightly, the hologram is completely different anyway. So and you only have access to the hologram. So you need to understand that any jewel that you put in front of the light, and the light in some sense would be like the consciousness, the ego function, and the jewel is like the belief, but it's like, well, you can change the light in such a way at a certain frequency, whatever, that it almost doesn't matter what the belief is. You can get anything out of it, and you can do anything to that hologram, because the actual hologram that it produces, you've learned how to interact with holograms, that you can do whatever you want with them anyway. So the actual facets on the belief, you're only trying to find the flaws in the jewel. You're only trying to find how it's not flawless. Where are the scuff marks? Where are the fractures uh, that are creating, in a sense, split holograms, that are creating a kind of wonky parallax and a kind of because that split hologram is basically the original superego, or the inner child and the adult ego. Uh, which are similar but different. Obviously, the two holograms that are produced they have an overlap, they have an interplay in which they blur each other and they overlap each other and they mix with each other, and then they have a difference, and then they have a lot of them are similar, but some of it is different. And you're just trying to find what is that flaw in the jewel of belief, in some sense, which essentially has to be found in decision space. But then even after you find the flaw, in this weird metaphor, the holograms have already been created, and they've already created secondary consequences and interactions. The two holograms have already interrelated with each other, and they have created holographic children. They've created holographic consequences. And so they've created sequences of and this is problematic as well, because you're not just dealing with one person, you're dealing with a community of different psychologies, of different personality styles. And so they are trading holographic objects which are in commercio, which are in a commercial function in some sense, or that they are in they are the currency of karma in some sense. And so you get these objects which imply these holographic distortions. And they imply them differently to different people, but they are part of this kind of web. So yeah, this all gets very complicated. And so managing managing these holographic things, you can manage them yourself on the level of distortion, on the level of, well, are you creating fractures or whatever? But in some sense, you're in a sea, you exist within a sea of tumultuous distortion, in which also people are trading in these things. They are fundamentally premised on being proprietors of those objects, those distorted holographic objects. And this is the subconscious functioning. And this is, generally what we are dealing with when we're dealing with other people. And even if we weren't dealing with this when we're dealing with other people, because we are proprietors of these objects, we make other people who aren't necessarily dealing in these objects deal in these objects as well, deal in our objects. Because the objects that we see that they possess, we see them as these holographic distortions. Because that's what the subconscious is. So the subconscious really is, what's happening in the subconscious is a full picture of karma to some degree. And this is a very important theory, I guess, because you have to understand that all the gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas, and all the emotional tones that I have described either fall into those three gunas, are part of a meta circuitry. So that tamas does actually interrelate with rajas and with sattva, and sattva does interrelate with rajas and tamas. They all interrelate with each other, but only a certain set of objects relate to each other, and so they create their own closed loops. So in some sense, it's weird that they are. There are four. In fact, in the Gita, I need to look this up again. There are 4 types of people. I think they're the. I can't even remember what they are, but the Vaish. I can't remember the Kastria. I can't remember, but those 4 different types. That actually would be interesting to look at that, because then I might. That's actually not. Maybe it's not so desirable, but it might be useful because then you can work out types of people, and then you can also understand. That would be a different way to pigeonhole people as well, because I have actually invented my own very elaborate way of classifying the different personality styles as being alpha, beta, gamma, omega, those 4 types, and actually sort of combinations of those types, that some people are alpha betas and some people are gamma alphas or something like that. I can't remember. But now that I've been talking in this recording, I think classifying them by their subconscious, because I've never actually made a recording like this in which I've sort of put all the pieces together. So I think that the subconscious, is, because this really actually puts therapy and puts metagram in perspective, like I've never put it in perspective before. So that's actually very helpful. In terms of what the theory of mind is. Some of the stuff is weirdly metaphor, because like when I say that, you don't have access to the unconscious mind. I wonder though, because like when you're dealing with the emotional tones, there are different emotional tones in the perception and the judgment, and so in some sense, some of these emotional tones are in different. Like I said, that that these emotional tones interlock with other emotional tones from other gunas. Well, the judgment and the perception is not from the same. It's not from the same thing. It's from a different thing. So like the vanity of someone will be an emotional tone, which will be in one band, and then the enticed lust of someone will be from another emotional tone, which will be connected to a different sattva, rajas, tamas, sort of thing. So that means that it's not, you'd have to have way more than just four different types of people. There would be a much greater variety. I mean, perhaps there's a rule that it actually centers around what the perception is, not what the judgment is. Maybe the perception of their subconscious will which will be the vanity. I've always thought that the vanity should be the main constituent descriptor of someone's personality style. That if you know the structure of their vanity, um, I think the vanity as well. I was thinking about this, and this comes through in my four sides of the mind model, which was something that I just made, which is not important and integral to any of my other structures, but it was something that I tried to do just to kind of get some more explanatory description of to be able to describe people in a very detailed way, just because I knew that I could make something like that. But I think that for example, in MBTI, the inferior function, as it's called, I think the inferior function relates to the vanity. Sorry, that's actually wrong. The inferior function relates to the vanity of the inner child, or the original superego, not to the vanity of the adult ego. And that is something that I need to get into as well, but I'm too tired to continue this recording. But that's what I need to get into, because everything that I've just said, I have not been speaking about the original inner child, other than the speculation that I made at the start about how actually I didn't go into it at all, because when I was talking about the false prophet and the false prophet contract, obviously that's going to have I was talking about how the original inner child would have its own false prophet and false prophet contract, but basically that is the most unwieldy sort of thing, because the false prophet and the false prophet contract would actually relate to the original, in terms of how I've currently got it mapped in terms of metatype, because metagram doesn't even include the original inner child, as it doesn't even include the false prophet and the false prophet contract. That in terms of where I've speculated where those things exist in this recording, they would the false prophet contract would correspond with the vanity of the original inner child or superego, and the false prophet would correspond with the enticed lust of the original superego. So basically, the original superego would then go death, lust, obviously vanity, enticed lust, and then also the vanity would also be the false prophet contract, and the enticed lust would be the false prophet, and then it would have trial, sin, and then the trial would also be the adult ego's death, and the sin would be the adult ego's lust. So if I'm right about that, and I'm a metatype 13, then my death is dimension 6, and my lust is dimension 7, and then my false prophet contract would be dimension 4, and my false prophet would be dimension 5 of my original superego. Oh my word, what would that mean? That would mean that the false ego complex, if that is true, would stretch from dimension 4 to dimension 16, which is 12 dimensions. And then, in some sense, it would only be 10 dimensions. I've always liked the number 10 because 10 relates to the Revelation scripture of 10 crowns. Sorry, 10 horns on the beast. Oh, I can't remember. Or was it 7 heads and 10 horns, I think. At some point, it's also 3 heads and 10 horns. But anyway, I always think that the extra 2 dimensions refer to the scripture where it says that you have to descend under the earth because one must descend before one ascends. And I think that the 2 extra dimensions might relate to essentially that they are not part of the beast. They are actually outside of the beast. They are like the environment in some sense. They are like, perhaps in Revelations, they could be equated to, who knows, it could be Gog, Magog, it could be the sea itself, it could just be the kind of the state of the world that contains the beast with 7 horns, 7 heads and 10 horns. Because that's not quite, I mean, that could be the dragon and the woman as well. That could be that sort of, because there's the beast, which has, at some point it has 3 heads and 10 horns, and some point it has 7 heads and 10 horns. And then it also talks about a child and a dragon and a child which is taken by a woman who is on the back of a dragon to go be born somewhere. And the dragon and the woman that is pregnant to have the child might be, in some sense, the progenitor of the false ego complex, which is like the kind of, as I say, these 2 dimensions or these 2 stages of the false ego complex, which are not part of the false ego complex, but which generated the false ego complex as a kind of environmental conditioning or imprint, as a kind of as a conflux of the individual psychology with an environmental inculcation. Those 2 dimensions could also be very important, because the more that I look at them, the more I think I see a metaphysical analogy, that they are perhaps also very good summaries to understanding someone. Because if you can understand the 2 dimensions that are immediately prior to their false ego complex, in some very subtle way, those are the linchpin of their their environmental unconsciousness, of the context in which that they are fundamentally projecting onto their immediate environment. And in some sense, that those 2 elements are also responsible for the propensity of the clean mind will still have a desire to re-engineer, to give birth to a new false ego complex. Just because you completely destroy the false ego complex doesn't mean that you've stopped the psychology propensity to generate another one, because it generated for a reason, and you need to sort of clean up that reason. And that reason is fundamentally, it doesn't exist in you, it exists around you. And it's something that you have to change about your perception of the environment to some degree. Or it's something that you have, it's not a belief about you, it's a belief about you and the world. I'll have to think about it some more, but it's something like that. Okay, well, this has been a very productive recording. But yeah, I need to do some work at better integrating the inner child and the adult ego. Okay, I've got a lot to continue with. Before I do continue, I feel like I need to make a general defense and of my style of speculation, because I can imagine just how it sounds to people from the outside. Although, if you've tolerated listening to it thus far, this might chase people off. But so the reason why I use the Christian scriptures, and actually I do also use Hindu scripture as well, but the reason why I use Revelation and the Christian scriptures when I'm speculating about this stuff is because I believe that I understand the Christian doctrine, and I understand its allegory, its metaphor, its spiritual language. I've decoded a large portion of its technology, as it were, its spiritual culture. I'm loath to call myself a Christian because I wouldn't want to be included under that heading with other people that identify as Christian, because I don't recognize their beliefs, I don't recognize their religious understanding. And my understanding of the Christian doctrine is almost, could very easily be justified as a secular, even an atheistic philosophy. But anyway, I take religion to be the first study of psychology. And so I even use other religious traditions when exploring these topics. But I have found that the Christian scripture is very precise, is very exacting about what it's talking about. It's hard to decode, and even the dreams of St. John at Patmos, I don't have a perfect deconstruction of them. But anyway, because of my general understanding of the Christian, of decoding the doctrine, I believe I'm sort of on firm ground as to what things are pertaining to what in the dreams of St. John, because the very fact that he transcribes them as a dream and he doesn't interpret them shows the level of unconsciousness that he can see the truth and he can describe it, but he has to describe it as a dream, not as a sermon, not as a set of allegorical sequences, and the truth is encoded in the structure of revelations. Anyway, and it is encapsulated in dream form because it could not be made conscious yet. Anyway, so that's why I deal with that, because I see it as the most sophisticated cutting edge of spiritual. In some sense, it has a lot of the pieces of the puzzle which are utterly missing in Hinduism. I have known Buddhists. In some sense, I see myself very much akin to the Buddhist temperament and the Buddhist yearning to reach satori, to understand the problem in consciousness, to understand the problems of the mind, the problems of these things. And I agree with the Buddhists in their disdain of the Hindus, of falling prey and being captured by the exoteric structure of the narrative, which the Buddhists don't have a sort of problem with, but the Buddhists, they're very almost like scientists, sort of are really getting into the mechanics, are really trying to understand what's there and what's to be done about it. Christianity seems to me to have actually the synthesis of all these elements, but they actually have a real project, a real plan, and a real method. But it's not easy to extract from the text. I don't believe in the authority of the scriptures. I believe in the authority of understanding, of a living understanding, and the scriptures are closed to many people. Many people are not, they're not in a state at which they can actually get any spiritual succor from the text. The written word is dead. You can make it do whatever you want. You can make it dance to the narrative, to whatever purpose, to whatever argument you might have. It can very easily be contorted. Um, it can very easily be interpreted. In some sense, there's very little point in arguing over the scripture. In some sense, I mean, there are literal contradictions in the text, all over the place. The only way to commend to find a solution to those contradictions is to actually understand context, to see that, because these things are spiritual. They're very deep. It's the thing that they're describing is very dynamic. And so if you don't treat it like a mystery that is being uncovered, and you don't realize that, well, in this text, in this scripture, they are dealing with this issue, and so it can only be understood in the context of that issue, and it's that part of the mystery. It's a mystery that's uncoded, because that is the only way that you can deal with a subject which is voluminous and complicated, is that you cannot understand it. Because to understand it, you would have to sit through a 20-hour lecture and have the patience to track everything that was being spoken about. So the only way to induct yourself into a very complicated subject matter is to use a low-resolution map of it, which is essentially the mysteries. That you know that you're dealing with this, that you're dealing with an issue that has to do with the crucifixion, the Son of God, and a lot of the exoteric problems in Scripture and problems in doctrine that arise is because it's not understood spiritually. It's understood, the metaphor is used as a literal external authority in some sense. It's not uh, it's not used to edify the spiritual body in some sense. It's used to calcify a narrative that people then live within. And a lot of these things which are supposed to be models, which are supposed to operate within the self, are relegated into into an external mystique and an external sort of fatalism or something like that. And and basically a lot of the things fall short because of not answering the further question that integrates them all, which is, what is the thing that then we have just learnt about? So if you understand that these are the features, the properties of the Son of God, these are the features and the properties and the description that is given in a text somewhere about what the Spirit of God is, about what God is, and then that question is not properly answered. Well, then what is God? What is the Son of God? What is Jesus Christ? That question never expands, or that question is never asked. No, it's too simple. Don't ask that question. It's just a narrative. You're living in the story, but and it's never related properly to the self. It's never integrated into how consciousness operates. Uh, the faith essentially never gets developed. The workings. Anyway, there's a sadness of faith which is endemic to the structuring of the false ego complex. Who is he that overcomes the world, even our faith? There's a anyway, that many people have baked into them a kind of a sad faith. But anyway, sadness, the existential sadness, the metaphysical sadness that I was talking about, that locks in the shape. But there is in the 17 model the 13th dimension. That is something, the gift of the priest, the gift of the teacher. Anyway, okay, so that's my general defense of using revelations. Now I'm just going to go back into that. So I was talking about the woman and the dragon being a progenitor of the false ego complex in some sense. Now, it's interesting because in some sense I think that the false prophet contract and the false prophet is similar to the woman and the dragon. If or maybe it's another false prophet and a false prophet contract. Maybe the woman and the dragon parallel to Revelations is the wrong one. But anyway, I believe that they are the original inner child or superego. And in some sense, this is constructive. This is not true necessarily. The woman and the dragon. So the woman and the dragon might be something like the medium in which the first language is acquired in a child's mind. That certain dimensions have to be bastardized, certain dimensions of psychological reality in the 17 model have to become bastardized in order to construct beliefs, in order to construct the unconscious side of the mind of the original superego or inner child. So that stable objects and words can be apprehended, or that so in some sense I think objects are acquired, or objects are the core of beliefs in some sense, that beliefs have to pertain to objects, but in some sense they don't exist by themselves until the beliefs themselves don't even exist, because how can you even describe a belief as existing or not existing, except if you know it's there by its use. And so already you don't even know that you have beliefs until they are in operation in some sense, until they are generating a subconscious. So you know that you have beliefs after the fact from the feelings and the feeling body and the emotional sort of paradigm that it, the hologram that it's casting, that is allowing you. So let's say the negative, as in like when you have a projector, you have a negative that the light is shining through to give you a positive hologram, a positive picture. The negative is like the belief, and the light is like the stream of consciousness, the ego function, and then the actual picture is the subconscious. So this whole thing is kind of, it's almost backwards, because the light, which is the active stream of consciousness, is constantly having to see the world, or to focus through the filter of the belief structure in order to create the hologram that it is in the midst of, that it is surrounded by, and that it's relating to and engaging with, or proceeding from. So it's weird that the act of thinking, and then there's also perhaps unthinking knowns as well, which are baked into that, which are also operating within the there's a hidden presence there in some sense, of the unthought knowns, which produce, in some sense, negative thinking, in that your thoughts are. It's like when you have a negative and you're shining light at the negatives, that you get a positive projection. That positive projection is not just the color that it appears, but it also subtextually implies that it's not the converse color, because then otherwise you wouldn't see the color that it appears as. So because of the fact that it's created through a negative, the positive color that it appears also implies that you can't think another color. Um, in the metaphor that the positive is what you're allowed to think about. You can't think about things that would dirty the negative, that would sully the negative, or deride the negative. Um, but the ego function, what it could do is it could kind of post hoc, it could imagine something different. It could imagine an alternative. It could sort of post hoc, uh, but when it is imagining something different, it's like a hypothetical contention. That's not the authentic feeling that it's feeling. So the question is, can it actually change what it's feeling? Well, it can do that by changing the negative, but that's on a second cycle. That's not on the initial cycle. In some sense, it can't. Anyway, there are some circuits in which the second circuit is very clearly a outgrowth of the first circuit. It's a secondary precipitation. So anyway, that the one circuit is an initiating one, and the second one is a optional second. Sometimes the second circuit isn't even optional. It's actually it's the one must follow the other before it can produce a judgment. But anyway, it's like a double barrel perception, and you get other ones that are like double barrel judgments. Anyway, okay, let me just move on. So the thing that I actually wanted to focus on, not those are details that are tangential for this kind of topic, is that there is an issue about the fact that a subconscious and an unconscious both don't exist without each other. They need to both be present for the other. They are both sufficient conditions for each other. If you have an unconscious, you have a subconscious, and if you have a subconscious, you have an unconscious. Um, so they are kind of like Hydra. If you try to tackle one, the other one will cover the other one. Anyway, so there's that element is important to keep in the back of your mind, because what I'm really trying to get at now is like, well, this, let's say, woman and dragon, which is a kind of like precondition a priori sort of atmosphere, or environmental sort of impact or force or something like that, or subtext. Sometimes it's really like a subtext. It's the subtext of the unconscious. It's the unconscious environment or something like that. It's very far removed. It's very kind of preemptive to even. It's preemptive to the generation of the inner child, of the unconscious of the inner child. It precedes the unconscious of the inner child. And then as soon as the unconscious of the inner child emerges, it already has a vanity, because without the vanity, as I say, it doesn't even know that it has a death and a lust. It doesn't even know that it has beliefs until it has a subconscious that it's operating within. And as soon as it has a subconscious that it's operating in, I think it already, or very quickly, starts to toy with with a meta escape of this system already, in which it wants to escape from the child and the dragon, if that is the right way to name it, or with the, let's say, I think, man, let me add some more jargon and make it weird. So, what I'm trying to get to is that what I have generally called in my last recording um, the false prophet contract and the false prophet, which corresponds with the original superego's subconscious, its vanity and its enticed lust of the inner child of the superego, um, that might be called the spirit of man, but both of those things together might be called the spirit of man, or rather just call it the false prophet and the false prophet contract. And maybe it's the woman and the dragon that is the spirit of man. Anyway, one of them should probably be called the false prophet, and the other one should be called the spirit of man, probably. In fact, actually, the spirit of man is maybe the one that is more vague, the woman and the dragon. And in some sense, the spirit of man, which I'm breaking up into the woman and the dragon, wants to be very quickly forgotten about. It wants to be very quickly sort of swept under the rug and displaced with a more tangible false prophet, because the false prophet and the false prophet contract is a conscious version of the same structure as the spirit of man or as the woman and the dragon. Only that you can think about the false prophet. You can't think about the woman and the dragon, because the woman and the dragon is just a kind of, it's like an outside influence that you are already baked into your environment. Your individuality or your individual liberty is already confused in a commixture between yourself and your environment, that you're already sort of baked in. And I do think that might also have to do that with the acquisition of a primary language, of a first language. Um, because there is no such thing as an object, as a pure object of in the mind, without relating it to a dead subject, yourself. You need a solid image in order to have other objects. And so the more you know about other objects, the more delineated your self image becomes, because knowledge of objects is knowledge of the subjective apprehension of the object. There's no, because the only other way to have an object uh, is from, let's say, a perfect knowledge of God, a God's eye view, which is in some sense the kind of the atheistic uh, oxymoronical paradox, that they think that they can, or that they idolize that frame of reference, but they don't believe it's possible. So they're kind of, they've got a weird kind of blind faith, where they have this faith that such a contemplative paradigm must be possible, or at least is desirable or ideal, but they know that it's inaccessible to what it is that human beings are. So they kind of quite rightly know that they cannot achieve the God's eye perspective, but they still have an idolatry around it, and they don't have any faith in the actual kind of creature that we're in, and they continue to sort of enviously pine after the disembodied, abstracted God's eye perspective over everything. The overreach there is that and the underreach as well, is that the incarnated is that the incarnated psyche contains the Spirit of God, not God. And yeah, I guess there's no simple way of saying this because it's just very, very complicated. That the conceptualization of God is dynamic, has a trinity in it, and how that trinity even is integrated between itself is a dynamic sort of thing that can be understood, but it's not a static belief structure. It's also an operational facility. It's a spirit cannot be made manifest in a fact. It can only be made manifest in discerning a purpose, which requires a spiritual vision as well, I guess. So in some sense, the eye is also perhaps a symbol of understanding. But I mean, this is very tricky because, you know, and Jesus essentially was crucified over this point because he said basically, me and my Father are one. But that it's not the same thing as embodying. It has the same quality in that it's the same spirit, and there's an internal connection to that conceptual dynamic. But I mean, this is also why the character of Jesus Christ is a template that we all share, that at our core and at the, let's say, apex of self-actualization, that what Jesus Christ is it's a condition of the mind. It's a condition of the understanding. It's a condition of the heart of understanding. Which again does not manifest as a belief. It manifests as a spirit. And I was going to say as well that the woman and the dragon, which I'm going to say together form the spirit of man. In some sense, that I said also in the last recording, that I think that that looking at those two dimensions through Metatype, you would get a general summary of the state of health of someone's psyche, because I think that in some sense, the more that people are grappling on that level against those within those two dimensions, will show the general state of the health of their psychology on a spiritual level or something like that. So basically, if they have reservations about the spirit of man, that they are searching to uncover those things, or if they have made peace with them, if they embrace the spirit of man. And this will manifest most robustly in terms of their attitude towards their own vanity. How comfortable, how self-assured are they in the structure of their own vanity? How much do they lean into their vanity and the narrative of their vanity? So in some sense, how comfortable their psychology is with their vanity will be a kind of, I think, will almost link to also how much acuity they have in rebelling or having reservations about the spirit of man. Uh, and in some sense as well, you might also find that all the great personality disorders could also be summarized as having a particular kind of archetypal relation to the spirit of man. And that might also be useful because if you know the metatype that you're dealing with, you know then which dimensions would correspond, which dimensions of psychological reality would correspond to the spirit of man. And then essentially also that could be used as an overarching tool as well, perhaps as a therapeutic lever, um, if those dimensions are amenable to being uh, explored and it can be easily isolated, perhaps, which, I mean, sometimes the state of a case might be such that they are so embroiled in some internal structural schism within the false ego complex that they're not capable of taking a wider, broader view and essentially looking at essentially how they're tackling with the spirit of man or their level of responsibility in terms of being able to have the ability to mount a reservation or even a looming sort of rebellion against their own structural. In some sense, the spirit of man might also be generally summarized as a kind of different levels of kind of learned helplessness. But on the level, with another level of subtraction, that it's learned helplessness, which is also an unthought known. But then you must realize that there are like two classes of unthought knowns, because there are unthought knowns in terms of the adult ego, and then there's this kind of unthought known, which is like an unthought known, which is not even about you. It's about your environment. It's about, and in some sense, when I say environment, I mean like the kind of the substrate of the environment. It's almost like unthought knowns about metaphysical, the metaphysical substrate of reality in some sense. So it's an unthought known about the realm of consciousness itself. It's like it's very abstract. It's very ethereal. It's very kind of, it's kind of like a very subtle container of the false ego complex in some sense. It's a, in terms of a subtle, in alchemy when they talked about subtle energies. So it's a kind of it's a subtle energy envelope. Um, this is very what's the term that they use? Minor arcana. This is the deepest level. This is as deep as the rabbit hole goes in terms of the minor arcana, the knowledge of the interior, the knowledge of the mind, of psyche, which people forget that the root of psychology, psyche, means spirit in Greek. Okay. So anyway, I'm just trying to say that there is a huge resonance, I think, between the false prophet and the spirit of man. And in some sense, I think the spirit of man is very unconscious, or I've described it as being fundamentally unconscious, and it's not even it's not your unconsciousness; it's the unconsciousness of the environment, which ends up kind of inducting you and pressuring you, conditioning you from the outside to operate in such a way in which you develop your own specific individual unconsciousness, which then comes to supplant the environmental unconsciousness. Because at least if it's your unconsciousness, which you have developed, and I think this is the appeal of the adult ego complex when you are a very young child and you've already developed your first language. Because then you become a secondary world. You're not actually prone to the travesty of the world. You've actually found a way to model the pressure that the world is exerting on you, and you're not dealing with it like an animal. You're dealing with it in terms of your own model of it. But then you have already baked into the mix. You're already within an envelope in which you are treating yourself as an animal. So these dimensions are dimensions that perhaps contain a lot of therapeutic juice, as it were, and the rehabilitation of those dimensions might be a form of destigmatization. They might be essentially the disability which the whole false ego complex rests, as a kind of existential sadness which makes the vanity, let's say, germane. In some sense, it is a kind of, it's an environmental mistake which the false prophet has a solution and a fix for. That the false prophet is the mender of the mistake which has been inherited via the inculcation of the spirit of man. Now, I don't even believe that someone has inherited the spirit of man. That's a metaphor, because that is how it is impressed upon the individual in their dealing with the false prophet. This, I think, in some sense, happens after the false prophet, through the process of being tutored and inducted by the false prophet. This becomes subtextually true after the fact. So the spirit of man is a preceding a priori subtext which is inserted post hoc via the talking to it and the involvement with the false prophet, which at the same time bakes in the inner child's unconscious mind. So I do think that in some sense, all of these things are happening at the same time. This is, when people are doing this in their very young psychological minds. I remember I did this very, very late. I did this way later than anyone else. I was doing this at around 6 years old in my mind, because I had found, I think I toyed with it at 4 years old. I came across it, and then I didn't continue with it because I knew that it was problematic. And then I realized that that was part of the development of the false ego complex. And then when I made it my plan to map it and to understand it so that I could develop general tools that would be a solution to it, then I went through with making my own false ego complex after designing it at around the age of 7. Um, but yeah, it really is a kind of backwards forward sort of thing that it makes sense that in some sense the seed needs to be planted by something. And it needs to be planted by something that's not you, because otherwise there is no external locus of control. So, in some sense, you are inducted into it by this spirit that you conjure in your head, the false prophet. And when it is planted into your unconscious mind of your original superego, then the root of it digs deeper below where it is planted, which is the spirit of man. So the root of it is like the spirit of man, and perhaps that relates to the woman and the child. So in some sense, even if you destroy the false ego complex, the root has not been removed. The root has not necessarily, so you can destroy the plant, but the root also needs to be uncovered. And in some sense, the root was never consciously generated. The root was never contracted. The root was an a priori sort of thing, and it can't even be seen unless you have a model of psychological reality, unless you have something like my 17 model. Because you're dealing with things that never touch the unconscious mind, but which had a kind of systemic, structural, it affected the substrate, and it also helped to ground the structure of the false ego complex from outside of it. And the root itself will also have consequences in the real world, as it were. The spirit of man has an impact on the flesh. It can be transcended when it can be apprehended and it can be dealt with. But in some sense, dealing with that is a spiritual question which psychology is really at odds with even being able to. You need an alchemical substrate. You need a model of psychological reality. Otherwise, you can't even begin to do anything and understand anything, because you have nothing to monitor that kind of behavior. Because this is behavior which is not even it's not even part of cognition. It has, in fact, it has nothing to do with cognition. It has to do with contextualizing cognition. Because those two things, I think, will even fall outside of metatype. Or no, they definitely fall outside metagram. Metagram can be extended towards all the dimensions that metatype talks to, except for these two dimensions. Technically I could include these two dimensions within metatype. They should be included in metatype, but in terms of integrating metagram and metatype, that'll only have 10 dimensions. And these two dimensions fall outside of those 10 dimensions, they fall before it. Okay, that's, I think, everything that I have to say about this, which is kind of novel. I still wanted to talk more about integrating these things, but okay, so how does this actually relate to actually a kind of therapeutic thing? Because I mean, whenever I talk about this, metagram always grounds me in the adult ego, and then the adult ego obviously then I'm only talking about metagram and the adult ego essentially so that you can get to understanding the importance of the false prophet and the false prophet contract, which has those two dimensions. And then as soon as you deal with that, you're dealing with like a whole loaded sandwich of pathology, which includes things that you were never privy to, that you were never conscious about, because you're dealing with things that now are kind of existential, consequential, a priori preceding a post hoc sort of metaphysical progenitor. So it's kind of like a secondary progenitor. You're dealing with a secondary progenitor because now you're dealing with a root structure which is just going to grow a new, it's just going to grow a new false ego complex unless you deal with the root. That even if you get to the point at which you can deal with the false ego complex, you have to deal with the root structure which grew after the seed was planted. So you were part of the seed. You were part of planting the seed even, but you were never part of the root. The root that grew from the seed is a secondary progenitor. Yeah, okay, so anyway, I've described it. So this is very important. Okay, I'm just going to end this recording. That's everything I have to say about this topic so far.